PTSD versus C-PTSD. How are they different, and why is this important when talking about complex dissociative disorders? Let's get into it. So, starting with PTSD. PTSD is characterized by being caused by events that happen once or over a shorter period of time. It is typically caused by things that are generally seen as more severe to the general population. In the criteria, this is listed as anything that causes a perceived threat of death, injury, or SA. These can be things like car accidents, natural disasters, or forms of assault. So, what are some potential symptoms of PTSD? Those with PTSD usually re-experience the trauma, typically in the form of flashbacks. They tend to be avoidant of things that may remind them of the event, and they may be prone to more negative thought patterns and hypervigilance. So, what about complex PTSD? C-PTSD is formed from repeated chronic trauma. The threshold for experiences being considered traumatic is much lower than it is with PTSD, including things like neglect and chronic stressors that would generally not be considered traumatic over a shorter period of time and would not meet the criteria for PTSD. Instead of being based on a single event, it is based on a series of inescapable events. So, what are some potential symptoms of C-PTSD? One may experience emotional dysregulation, such as having overwhelming emotions or mood swings, and potentially leading to mood disorders. They may have a negative view and be very critical of themselves. They may have trust issues, which may make relationships very difficult, and they may experience changes to and disconnection from one's identity. It is also common for those with C-PTSD to minimize their trauma and symptoms, thinking that they aren't that bad. As we mentioned in our video on structural dissociation, we will link that up here if you want to learn more. PTSD and C-PTSD experience different forms of structural dissociation. Those with PTSD experiencing primary structural dissociation, with one part that handles day-to-day life and another that handles trauma, typically presenting in the form of a flashback, and those with C-PTSD experiencing secondary structural dissociation, still having the one part that handles day-to-day life, but multiple parts that handle trauma. This structure is also present in otherwise specified dissociative disorder and partial dissociative identity disorder, though with C-PTSD, these parts are not autonomous. In PTSD, dissociation is typically more situational in relation to triggers, while with C-PTSD, it tends to be more chronic and can have more of an effect on identity and memory. So, how does this connect to complex dissociative disorders? Complex dissociative disorders are formed through chronic, inescapable childhood trauma. This trauma will always meet the criteria for C-PTSD and comes with the same types of symptoms. While they do meet the criteria for C-PTSD, not all complex dissociative disorder systems will meet the criteria for PTSD. Around 90% of those with dissociative identity disorder meeting the criteria for PTSD. So, why is this? Some of those with the disorder will not have experienced any traumatic events that are associated with PTSD. As complex dissociative disorders are formed through chronic trauma, the threshold for trauma is much lower than it is with PTSD. Chronic trauma may also at times blend together, making it hard to identify individual events. But also, importantly, dissociative identity disorder comes with amnesia. Some may not be able to identify the events that would have caused them to have PTSD. Symptoms of PTSD may not be present, as the system doesn't know to avoid and fear things that they don't remember happening. Individual alters may also be dissociated enough from it that it doesn't have the same impact to them. But many people with complex dissociative disorders don't think their trauma was enough to cause their disorder. So why might this be? For one, they may be part of the 10% of DID systems who didn't experience abuse or who don't have PTSD. But it is important to note that that is still 12.5 million people in the world, and that it doesn't account for those with OSCD1 or PDID. While it is a small percentage of people with the disorder, and you may find it hard to find others who share your experiences, there will still be a decent number of people in the world who share your experience, and it is noted as valid in both the DSM-5 and the ICD-11. A lot of forms of chronic trauma have also been normalized or tend to be ignored in society. If society in general deems something as not a big deal or a normal experience, your brain may not think that it is a big enough deal to justify the response, when in actuality it is big enough, and it's society that's wrong. Dissociation can also work to hide trauma responses. You, as an individual alter, may be more dulled to the trauma responses, as you may be more dissociated from them, and other alters hold the brunt of it. Just because you aren't experiencing it doesn't mean that the trauma responses don't exist. As we mentioned earlier, minimization of symptoms is a common symptom of C-PTSD. When experiences are chronic, they may become normalized to you and seem less significant to you than they would to those who haven't experienced it, as well as less significant than your trauma responses would suggest. It is also common to blame yourself for the trauma occurring. It is much easier to minimize it if you think you deserved it in some way. But despite this being a common thought pattern, for those who experience chronic traumatization, absolutely no one deserves to be traumatized. And absolutely nothing you could have done would have made you deserving of this disorder. Some symptoms of chronic traumatization also regularly manifest significant periods of time after the trauma occurred. It is not always clear what trauma could have caused the trauma responses to occur based on the amount of time that has passed. And of course, there is always the possibility that they may have amnesia for their trauma. It's very easy not to think that your trauma was bad enough when you simply can't remember it. Unfortunately, in this community, many play the Trauma Olympics, which will only make many minimize their own experiences more, as they compare them to others. But it is also important to acknowledge that this has some basis in common trauma responses, and it is understandable why it happens, even when it is acknowledged as harmful. Many traumatized individuals seek external validation for internal experiences. They may feel a lack of validation if they don't see others experiencing things just like them, and may use this to justify not being in the same group as those who don't mirror them closely enough. Whether that is to say, I have it worse than others, so only those who have it as bad as me can have the disorder, or the inverse, I didn't have it as bad as others, so I can't have the disorder. But it is important to learn to validate your own lived experiences while recovering from trauma, as it is not healthy to depend on others for validation long term. What dissociative or trauma disorder you have is also not indicative of how bad the traumatic events were. There will be those with seemingly small traumas that have a big effect, and those with OSDD1 and PDID that have seemingly bigger traumas. You can't tell how bad someone's trauma was based solely on what disorders they do or do not have, as there are other factors at play that may impact this beyond the trauma itself. But above all, it is important to remember that trauma is the response, not the event. It doesn't matter how bad the events seem if the responses are there. Many people will have complex dissociative disorders while having trauma from events that really don't seem bad or potentially traumatic by society's standards. We need to remember that the keys to what is more likely to develop the disorder lies more in the duration of time the adverse experiences occurred over, if they can be escaped by means other than dissociation, and of course in those cases that you actually chose the path that isn't dissociate, and whether you had a good support system to help you work through potentially stressful situations. And of course, remembering that as this is happening to a child, there are resources that are naturally not going to be available to them that may be accessible to your average adult. If you have a trauma response, whether or not you recognize it yourself, then your trauma was inherently valid, no matter how small and potentially unworthy of a response it may seem to be. But I think that's all I had to cover for trauma disorders and responses for this video. I hope this helped you understand them a bit better. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. It would be great if you liked the video if you liked it and subscribe to see more content like this. We are getting close to our first subscriber goal of 50 subscribers. So if you could subscribe to help us reach this goal, that would be amazing. If you want to vote on how we celebrate, there is currently a poll running on our channel that you can vote on. Current votes are going to Q&A video or gaming live. So if you have any questions for a Q&A or suggestions for games to play or times you would be available for a gaming live, feel free to let us know. We will be putting up a poll for what games we should play as well, if you want to go and vote on that. Speaking of games, we are planning to start streaming on Twitch sometime next month. So if you have any suggestions for that, feel free to let us know as well. If you're looking for more videos to watch, you can check out our video on the differences between complex dissociative disorders up here. Or if you're interested in learning more about complex dissociative disorders in general, you can check out our playlist down here. I hope you're having a great day, and we'll see you in the next one.